Death at Rottingdean, Chapter 14. A German colleague in natural history asked an old Spanish lawyer in Chile what he thought of the King of England sending out a collector, Charles Darwin, to his country to pick up lizards and beetles and to break stones. The old gentleman thought seriously for some time and then said, "It is not well. No man is so rich as to send out people to pick up such rubbish. If one of us were to go and do such things in England, do you not think the King of England would very soon send us out of his country?" Charles Darwin, The Voyage of the Beagle. Here begins the great game. Rudyard Kipling, Kim. Kate had thought of taking the Panhard for the trip to Black Rock, but Charles wanted it to drive to Brighton to attend the autopsy, should it be held that day. So when Aunt Georgie suggested that they take a dog cart, Kate readily agreed. It was an early hour for calling, but Aunt Georgie was energetically determined to inquire into the welfare of the young widow, and as equally determined, when they returned, to begin her canvass of the village in order to discover what might be learned about the murders. And Kate, for her part, was also anxious to talk to Mrs. Radford. She might know something that could shed some light on the questions left by the two deaths. It was a pity to intrude on her grief, Kate thought, but better that the questions were asked by two sympathetic women than by one unfeeling man. Aunt Georgie chirped to the pony that Mr. Mounter had brought round. Patrick leapt up behind in the four-wheeled cart, and they were off. As they drove up High Street in the direction of the sea, Kate saw small clumps of people talking together, and she guessed that word of Captain Smith's murder was beginning to make its way around the village. One trio of gossiping women, including her own cook-housekeeper, Mrs. Portney, who had a basket over her arm and was animatedly discussing something with the other two. Mrs. Portney glanced up, a look of consternation crossing her pinched face when she saw Patrick. She elbowed one of the others, who turned to stare narrow-eyed as they drove past. Patrick himself sat with hunched shoulders, his head down, and Kate hoped that she had not put the boy into further difficulty by asking him to come with them. Black Rock lay on the Dover coach road on the way to Brighton, about 2.5 miles to the west of Rottingdean. When they came to the steep climb up the shoulder of Beacon Hill just outside the village, Patrick jumped out to walk and spare the pony his weight. Once at the top, they could almost see to Brighton, where the shining groins reached out long fingers into the ocean. Before them, between grassy banks, stretched the white ribbon of narrow road, its surface powdered to a fine white chalk by horses' hooves and wagon wheels. On the left was the heaving ocean stretching to the southern horizon, on the right the rolling downs lifting to the north. The early mist had given way to a bright blue sky, dazzling sunshine that turned the ocean to a silver glitter and a clean salt breeze. It was a fine day for a drive, Kate thought, or it would have been if the purpose had not been so gloomy. Aunt Georgie, her shoulders straight, her mouth set in a firm line, guided the pony past Beacon Hill, where a small knot of uniformed men and several horses and wagons stood in front of the windmill. "Those must be the men of the Brighton Chief Constable," she said. "I'm glad to see that Sir Robert received my telegram and came so promptly." Kate did not correct Aunt Georgie's mistaken impression, for she had not told her that the Prince had assigned Charles to the case and had instructed the Brighton Chief Constable to assist him. She also refrained from telling her of the investigation that she and Charles and the boy had made that morning, not because she did not trust Aunt Georgie, but because she could not be sure of the servants. Mr. and Mrs. Mounter were villagers, and Kate was beginning to wonder just how many of Rottingdean's inhabitants might be involved, one way or another, in this mysterious affair. Patrick had jumped back into the cart, and the pony was about to start the downhill slope of Beacon Hill when they were met by a comical-looking man with a fuzzy grey side whiskers, wearing a waterproof cloak, wide-brimmed canvas hat, and drab breeches. He had a knobbed walking stick in one hand and a map in the other, and a bulging knapsack on his shoulder from which hung a rock hammer, a telescope case, a large silver compass, a drinking cup, and a paired fork and spoon, and a closed wicker basket. He was wearing smoked glass eye preservers against the ocean's glare, and had a meerschaum pipe in his mouth. He waved at them to stop, and Aunt Georgie reined in the pony. "Good morning, dear ladies," the man said humbly, stuffing the pipe into his pocket and snatching off his hat to reveal hair that was darker than his whiskers. He spoke in a continental accent, with an almost droll lift at the end of each sentence. "Pardon, but may one inquire whether you are acquainted with the cause of the commotion there by the windmill?" "It's the Chief Constable from Brighton," Aunt Georgie said importantly. "Sir Robert Pinkney. He's investigating the death of the captain of the Coast Guard." "A death," the man said, and shook his head sadly. "An accident, one must presume." "A murder," Aunt Georgie replied. Kate could not see the man's eyes, which were hidden behind his smoked lenses, but his mouth seemed to take on a wry twist. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed and replaced his hat. "A Coast Guard captain murdered in so pure and virtuous a village? And how was the poor chap killed, pray tell?" Kate frowned, wondering at the man's odd interest, but everything about the fellow struck her as absurd, as if he was some sort of caricature. Aunt Georgie, on the other hand, who accepted people as they came, answered with perfect sincerity. "He was shot," she replied. "It is the second death in only a few days. The other was a Coast Guard as well." "Then Coast Guarding would seem to be a most hazardous occupation," the man remarked. "One wonders whether the other was murdered too." "That is not clear," Aunt Georgie said. "The inquiry has yet to be held." She cocked her head to one side. "Your occupation, sir, and your business in our village?" "I?" He stroked his side whiskers as he replied. "I am an antiquarian with a deep interest in the early settlements of this region. I have been making a survey for a paper I am preparing for the Journal of Antiquarian Investigations. Specifically, I am searching for antiquities and artifacts of the Celtic Iron Age." He unrolled a map. "Yours is not the first village situated at this location, dear ladies. The earliest settlements were that of Neolithic period, about 2½ centuries before the present era, but they continued through the Bronze and into the Iron Age. After a rain, one can still see trace of the mounds and ditches and walls of the Flint people. And I must tell you," he gestured toward the windmill, "that your unfortunate Coast Guard is not the first to die upon that hill. According to my researchers, it is also the site of a burial pit from the late Iron Age containing the skeletons of 4 adults, and—" "Indeed," Aunt Georgie said, lifting the reins. "Well, that is all very interesting, sir, but I'm afraid we cannot linger. However, if you will call at North End House come afternoon, I shall be glad to hear more of what you have learned. I am a member of the parish council, and could arrange for you to address the entire village, if you like. Our schoolhouse is available for lectures of general interest." The man whipped off his hat again and bowed gallantly. "I should be delighted to make such an address, Madam Council Member. May one humbly inquire as to your esteemed name?" "I am Georgiana Burne-Jones," Aunt Georgie replied, "and this is Lady Charles Sheridan." "And your name, sir?" Kate asked quickly, thinking that she should mention the encounter to Charles. Despite the man's whimsical appearance and manner, his question struck her as having some purpose at which she could not entirely guess. "I am Professor Valdemar Hertling," the man said. "Please do not allow me to detain you any further," and he bowed again so smartly that Kate almost expected him to click his heels together. "What an odd man," Kate remarked when they had driven on. "I don't think I've ever seen anyone like him before." "Well, I've seen him before," Patrick said scornfully. "He comes around every few months, digging and poking and measuring in the oddest of places." "I doubt very much he's an antiquarian," Aunt Georgie declared. "Those 4 skeletons he mentioned, they were dug up some 30 years ago. I'm sure he had nothing to do with the digging. Certainly it's no news to any of us who have lived in this area." "I wonder then," Kate said thoughtfully, "why he was asking about the Coast Guard." She turned halfway around in the seat to speak to Patrick, who was sitting sideways in the cart. "You seem to have been acquainted with Captain Smith. What kind of man was he?" Patrick looked at her, and she saw the furrow between his eyes and heard the hesitation in his voice, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I only know what people have said of him, really. He came here just after I did. That would be 3 years ago. I don't think he was much liked in the village." "Why?" Patrick shrugged. "He liked to have things his own way. I don't know much about it. He was above the other Coast Guards, though." "That's right," Aunt Georgie said, using the brake to slow the cart's descent so that it would not injure the pony. "The Coast Guard at Rottingdean is a captain. The Coast Guards of Black Rock and Saltdean take their orders from him." "And what do Coast Guards do exactly?" Kate asked. They had reached the steepest part of the hill, and Patrick jumped out of the cart and walked alongside again. They patrol the cliffs every night. The Coast Guard from Black Rock walks to the east and meets the Rottingdean captain at an appointed spot along the cliffs, then walks back again. The captain then walks to the east and meets with the Saltdean Coast Guard and walks back again. That's their job, patrolling the coast. Each has a 3-mile stretch, more or less. "But if there is no more smuggling," Kate asked curiously, "why do they patrol? Are they supposed to watch for sailors in distress?" Patrick gave a short, hard, curiously adult laugh. "No more smuggling. Feeling that they were close to getting somewhere at last, Kate was about to ask him what he meant, but just at that moment they heard the blare of a motor-car horn behind them, and Aunt Georgie, making soothing noises, hastily guided the pony to the verge. It was Charles in the Panhard with a portly frock-coated man, Sir Robert Pinkney, the chief constable of Brighton, according to Aunt Georgie. Patrick ran to hold the pony's head, and they waited until the motor-car had passed, Charles and his passenger waving at them. When Patrick climbed back into the cart, he seemed to have regretted his ironic remark, and Kate could get no more out of him. Black Rock was a terrace of small villas facing the sea, one of them doing duty as a post office. Beyond the villas, with their banked-up gardens, was a prosperous-looking farm with a sign announcing that it was owned by Charles Cowley, and then Patrick pointed out the whitewashed slate-roof Black Rock Coast Guard station. The station stood on the downs side of the road, behind a hedge of tamarisk bushes, a flagstaff topped with the Coast Guard's white ensign set just inside the gate. On the worn stone doorstep, under a bower of late-blooming red roses, sat a forlorn boy of 5 or 6, a twig broom beside him. His head was down, his shoulders sagging dejectedly. 2 solicitous white geese stood guard beside him, as if to ward off intruders, and a trio of white chickens were pecking at the dirt. Aunt Georgie stopped the cart, took a cloth-covered basket from beneath the seat, and they all got out. Patrick stood by the pony's head, while Kate and Aunt Georgie went up to the boy. The geese stretched out their necks, hissing, but Aunt Georgie ignored them. "Is your mother at home, child?" she asked gently. The boy lifted his tear-stained face. "In there, Mum," he said, jerking his head. "Me dad's been drownded. She's crying." "Well, don't you cry," Aunt Georgie commanded. "Your mother needs a man to help her about the house, my lad, and you must fill your father's shoes." "Fill me dad's shoes?" The boy's eyes widened. "Oh, no, Mum, they're too big for me, but I can help me mother." He jumped up and began to sweep the path, tears raining down his face. Kate felt the unutterable pathos in the child's worth and longed to comfort him, but she knew that she could not. Only time would heal the loss of the father he had loved, and perhaps not even that. Perhaps he would carry the scar to his own dying day. The door was ajar, and they knocked and entered at a woman's bidding. After the brightness of sea and sky, the inside of the cottage was so dark that it was a moment before Kate could see anything. There appeared to be 2 rooms side by side, with a third smaller one behind, a kitchen perhaps, or a pantry, and a loft above. The brick-floored room into which they had entered was fitted with a small writing desk in the brightest corner, beside a casement window curtained in a checkered gingham, a paraffin lamp on a shelf above it. A cheaply framed print of the Queen and the Prince Consort hung on the wall, and a man's black oilskins hung from a peg beside it. A table and 2 benches were arranged in front of the fireplace, which held the cold ashes of a small fire. An earthenware teapot and 3 empty plates pottled with grease and the remains of breakfast lay at one end of the table, through the door into the other room. Kate could see a small child, a boy, asleep on a narrow cot, his blonde hair rumpled, his thumb in his mouth. To one side of the fireplace, in a stuffed chair that was the only comfortable piece of furniture in the room, sat a woman in a dark woolen dress, a shawl drawn tightly around her. She looked up. "Good morning, Miss Radford," Aunt Georgie said cordially. "I am Lady Burne-Jones, and this is Lady Sheridan. We have come to offer our heartfelt condolences at the loss of your husband." She put the basket on the table. "I have brought some elderberry wine, a kidney pie, and some jam puffs." "Thank ye," the woman said, in a voice that was scarcely more than a whisper. "You're more unkind, I'm sure, me lady." She was slight and very young, barely above 21 or 2, Kate thought, with chestnut hair pulled back severely from her child's face. She struggled to rise, but could not, and was taken by a fit of coughing that shook her slender shoulders. "Please, don't get up, Miss Radford," Kate said. Impulsively, she went to the child woman and knelt beside the chair. "We know this is a terrible time for you and your children. If there is any way that we can help, you must allow us to try." But the words, so conventional, seemed paltry and thin in her own ears. Mere speech could not comfort a woman who had lost her husband in such a terrible way. Words could not recompense the children for the loss of their father, who would have guided them to manhood by his own manhood's example. Kate thought briefly of Charles sorrowing for the son that he would never have, and knew that the sorrow of these sons for their father must be equally sharp. But Aunt Georgie was not at a loss for words. "Yes, my dear," she said crisply. "As a member of the Rottingdean Parish Council, I speak for the entire parish when I say that we will be glad to offer you whatever assistance you may require. You shall have to leave this station, as it will be wanted for the man who will take your husband's place, but I shall see that housing is arranged in one of the village poor relief cottages for you and the children, and food and clothing shall be provided as well. Of course, the boys shall be put to school, or some sort of work shall be found for you. We have recently appointed a new group of poor law overseers who are responsible for the village charities, and I can guarantee you that even though you may have no money, you will not go hungry or homeless. Our village has a good heart and is compassionate toward the needy. She opened her purse and drew out a piece of paper and a pencil, looking around the room as if she were assessing the condition and value of its furnishing. Now then, shall we make a list of what you have and what you need so that I can report your requirements to the overseers? Kate knew that these offers stemmed from Aunt Georgie's compassionate conviction that society should take care of those who could not care for themselves, and from her own sympathetic kindliness. But she couldn't help cringing at the older woman's tone, which to her ears sounded patronizing and disrespectful. If Mrs. Radford was offended, however, she did not show it. She merely said, "Oh, you're too kind to be sure," and even the quietly spoken words brought on another fit of coughing, which quickly turned into weeping. Aunt Georgie, truly soft-hearted beneath her officious exterior, dropped her pencil and paper and gathered up the young woman into her arms with a murmured, There now, my dear, cry if you must." Kate took the teapot into the tiny but immaculate kitchen, which proved to contain a coal cooker with the remnants of a fire. She poked it until it blazed up, filled the kettle with water from a bucket on the wooden sink, and in a few minutes had produced a pot of fragrant tea. A few moments after that, sipping her tea gratefully, Mrs. Radford was calm enough to say, with quiet dignity, "I'm obliged to you for your help, but me and the children wouldn't like to go on poor relief. My brother's coming tomorrow to help me bury George, if they gives me his body back. Afterwards he'll fetch us to Manchester to live with me mum. I'll go out to Char and she'll look after the boys." She looked around the dark room. "It is a sad thing to leave this fine big cottage and the garden and the chickens and geese. The boys was happy here in the clean air. 'Tain't so clean in Manchester, and me mum's house none so fine." Her voice took on a firmer tone and she gave Aunt Georgie a sideways glance. "But the boys will go to school, I'll make sure of that." Kate drew on one of the benches near Mrs. Radford's chair. "You and your family have lived here long?" "Near on 2 years." The young woman put up a hand and pushed an escaping tendril behind her ear. A tender look crossed her face. "George loved the sea. Oh, he loved it. He used to go over the road and stand on the cliff and watch the ships and the fog blowing in across the water." The tenderness turned to a sour indignation, but he didn't throw himself into it, as some in Rottingdean is trying to say. "Who has told you that he had?" Aunt Georgie asked in a sharp voice. "Well, the constable's been here, of course," Miss Radford said bleakly. "He says George flung himself off the cliff and somehow fell on his blade afore he tumbled into the water, and that's what killed him. He wanted me to say that George was dark by nature and given to fits of despair. But it's not true that he threw himself off, I mean." She took a deep breath, seeming stronger. "And he didn't stumble off drunk neither. George was a good man who loved his babes and me. He was proud and honest his work as a coastguard too, not like some who could be named. I won't have it said otherwise." The last was exclaimed with a painful bitterness and followed by another violent fit of coughing. "I shall speak to Constable Woodhouse," Aunt Georgie said imperiously. "Whatever the fact of the matter, he had no business speaking to you in such a manner." Kate went quickly to the tiny kitchen to fetch a cup, poured it half full of the elderberry wine that Aunt Georgie had brought, and put it to the young woman's lips. "Drink this," she commanded. "It'll ease the coughing." When Mrs. Radford was herself again, Kate took her seat again and asked in an even, quiet voice, "Did your husband tell you that there were others who were not honest in their work as coastguards?" Aunt Georgie drew in her breath sharply, but Mrs. Radford did not appear to notice. She had lifted her head and was gazing at Kate, her luminous dark eyes filled with something that might have been distress or fear or anger, or perhaps even all three. Kate met her gaze squarely and found something in it so compelling that she heard herself speaking before she had thought what to even say. "Whatever you tell us, Mrs. Radford, will be entirely secure. We shan't say or do anything that could bring harm to you or the children, more harm than you have already innocently suffered, which is more than anyone should bear. But if you have any information, I shall ask my husband to use it to clear your husband's name of the charge of suicide. Lord Sheridan is skilled in criminal investigations and has connection at the highest levels of government. He will do what he can to see your husband exonerated." The moment the rash promise had flown out of her mouth, Kate regretted it. What gave her the right to speak for Charles or to encourage this poor woman to pin her hope to a truth that might prove false? She had no idea what a full and careful investigation might reveal. Charles might discover that George Radford had indeed been drawn into some sort of illegal activity and had been murdered by his criminal cohorts, or had done himself to death out of guilt and shame for his dishonourable deeds. For his grieving widow, outrage would be added to anguish, and she would be justified in thinking herself and her children betrayed by someone who had promised help and friendship. The silence was suddenly broken by a raucous gabble of geese. Then the doorway darkened, and Kate felt rather than saw that Patrick had come to the door. But Mrs. Radford, whose eyes were fastened on Kate's face, seemed not to see that he was standing on the stone step. She must have read some reassurance there, for after a moment she gave a slight nod and stretched out her hand. Kate took it, feeling the fingers icy cold. "'Tis Captain Smith," she whispered. "He's the one who deals in crooked goods. Remove Captain Smith is what George said had to be done. Remove Captain Smith, and it'll all end." "What will end?" Kate asked, suddenly recollecting that the captain had been removed, although Mrs. Radford could not have known it. Mrs. Radford cast down her eyes, and Kate thought she was not going to answer. But a moment later she raised them again, now full of flashing anger. "Are you blind?" she demanded fiercely. "Are you foolish? Why, the smuggling, of course. The old village in on it. How do you think a woman as poor and lowly as Dora the Orwood could open a dress shop, I ask you?" She seemed to take courage from her own words as she pulled herself up straight in the chair and turned her gaze, withering now and scornful, on Aunt Georgie. "You think you're so high and mighty, me lady, with your poor relief cottages and your overseers and such. Your village may have a good heart, but its soul is rotten right through. Me brave and pure husband, God bless him, knew all about it, and he was ready to tell the truth, so they killed him." "Who killed him?" Kate asked sharply. "How do you know?" But Mrs. Radford had said all she could. She fell into such a savage bout of weeping that Kate and Aunt Georgie could do nothing but wait until she had quieted a little and then take their leave. As they left the cottage and were walking down the path to the dog cart, Kate saw a wagon passing, a team of horses driven by a uniformed constable. In the back of the wagon lay two sheet-covered corpses. George Radford and Captain Smith might have been enemies in life, but they were making their final journey together.